Hi, and welcome to the first online session of cyber citizenship. Hopefully this will go fairly smoothly. Couple caveats. One, I may be getting a better camera as the semester goes on, but I think this is good enough for now. And two, I hate being filmed or having my picture taken. So I may be like super awkward through the first few of these videos. And I apologize, but you know, we're doing the best we can right now. What I want to talk about today is chapter 4 from the Hall and Sinclair book. I've got my notes here. So that was the reading assignment actually for last week that we didn't end up getting to in class. Now, Hall and Sinclair, chapter 4, are looking at the comment section of political YouTube videos and asking whether you can actually have a productive democratic discourse in that sort of venue. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. And they actually do a lot of empirical work, counting comments and most liked comments and things like that, that we'll talk about later on. But what I want to address today is an issue that comes up very early on in chapter 4, and that is civility. So one of the frequent complaints, both about modern politics in general, and more specifically political discussions on the internet, is that they lack civility. That civility, that specifically political civility, has decreased in our society. And so this is one of the issues that Hall and Sinclair want to address. Now, in terms of both, is this important, as well as is this actually a problem? And in terms of is the lack of civility or is a lack of civility problematic, Hall and Sinclair answer basically yes, but we also want to be careful about how we define the term civility. Because too often when people talk about civility in politics, or particularly a lack of civility in politics, what they really are talking about is politeness. That people are being insufficiently polite to each other, that we need to be nice to each other. And that is not the definition that Hall and Sinclair buy into. They're going to define civility a little bit differently and a little bit more literally to have to do with civic discourse, right? Is this the type of culture, are these the type of attitudes that promote a healthy and productive civic discourse? And in fact, they see the civility as politeness definition as being very counterproductive. And that treating civility as politeness, and politeness therefore is a necessary criteria of political discussions, is actually not a good thing and not healthy. And two reasons for this come up in their work, though I'm happy to hear sort of any other reasons that you may have as you think about this topic. The first and biggest one that they talk about is that we can then often default to not talking about politics at all, right? If you're told to be polite, then one of the sort of default options is don't bring up issues that might be controversial, right? We've all heard like, don't talk about politics or religion. And while this might be good advice for like getting through Thanksgiving dinner, it's obviously going to be hugely problematic if you're trying to have a political discourse and people aren't allowed to talk about politics, or more specifically, aren't allowed to talk about issues on which people aren't already in agreement. And so in that sense, calls for civility can end up stifling sort of genuine political discourse. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that specifically calls for civility are often used to silence minority voices. Now, using minority here in both senses, in the sense of racial and ethnic and religious minorities, and this is something Hall and Sinclair talk about, the civil rights movement in the 1960s being criticized for not being sufficiently civil, that those activists were not polite, they weren't nice to people. But also minority in the sense of anyone who is not in the political majority in the place that they are. And the reason for this is when people are sort of in the minority like that, when they disagree with the majority, their viewpoints are much more likely to make people feel uncomfortable, right? If 80% of the population thinks everything is hunky-dory, but 20% is really genuinely unhappy with the status quo, then bringing that up can feel to the majority, again, who are happy and satisfied with the status quo, as uncomfortable, as unfair. You know, we don't want to talk about that. I'm sorry, I just realized one of my chickens is across the street. Okay, I'm gonna have to fix that in a moment. That's not good. Oh God, Sally. Anyway, we'll try and wrap this up fairly quickly. Right, and so calls for civility are often used to try and silence minority voices in this sense. And that, again, is a problem if you're trying to have a genuine political discourse and you want to hear all of the different perspectives. Because if the status quo is working for 80% of the population but really not working for the other 20%, that is a problem that people need to be aware of. And we shouldn't discourage people from sharing that information. So that's sort of the problem with civility is politeness. So what is our other option in terms of talking about civility? Well, civility are sort of rules for engagement that encourage a healthy democratic political discourse. And there are a few examples that stood out to me. The first one was that civic comments give you genuine information, right? And so under this criteria, the difference between Senator Smith is a moron and Senator Smith's tax plan will double the national deficit is not that the first comment is too impolite, even if it is. It's that the first comment doesn't actually give me any hard facts. It doesn't give me any information to work with. We're saying Senator Smith's tax plan will double the national deficit gives me some information to work with. It adds to my knowledge of this political situation, right? And so there's that aspect. One thing that you can look for in civil comments is that they actually add information to the discussion. The second possibility that stood out to me, and this is something that also comes up in Hall and Sinclair, is that civil comments leave open the possibility for future collaboration, right? That someone that I disagree with on this issue, I am still willing to work with in the future. And that's a really important part of democratic culture, right? That is something that Robert Putnam talked about in Bowling Alone. It's something that came up in our discussions of technology and society and social interactions online, is that one of the criteria for civic culture is that people are willing to disagree but still work together in the future, and willing to disagree on some issues, right, but leave open that possibility that in the future we might be on the same side, right? It's not we have two camps and we're enemies, it's we disagree on this issue. So the idea here is, in terms of some of the suggestions you get, and this is where there is some overlap between civility as good civic discourse and civility as politeness, is you want to stay away from things like personal insults and name calling. Again, not because they're rude, but because if I say Senator Smith is a moron and Senator Smith is a liar and Senator Smith is a crook, then that makes it much more difficult for me to work with Senator Smith a week later when we're talking about a totally different topic, right? And that's actually a really important part of democratic culture. This idea that we can disagree now but agree later on something else. And that we might have shifting coalitions, right? That if we're talking about social issues, this group votes together, but if we're talking about national security, this group votes together, or economic policy, a different group votes together. And that actually leads to a much more stable democratic society in the long run. Because when you have those permanent camps, right, this team versus that team, that leads to instability, basically because if one of those groups is in the majority, then that second group starts to feel like they're getting robbed, right? Like there's no hope that they will ever come out on the winning side. Where when the coalitions are continually shifting, there's a lot greater sense that just because I was the losing side on this vote, I'm still going to stick with these institutions because the next time around, right, I'm hopeful that it might turn out differently. And having that hope for a different outcome in the future is what keeps people working through political institutions rather than resorting to political violence. And so that's an important aspect of civic culture much more broadly. I hope that made sense to all of you. So we're basically going to then continue this discussion in the discussion threads that I will be building in the forum on Blackboard. And I am looking forward to hearing from you. Also, let me know if you have any suggestions about video quality. My chicken did cross back into my own yard, so I'm grateful for that, though I will still have to go out there and round her up. They're being very problematic right now. But yes, so I hope you are all doing well. Happy St. Patrick's Day. It may not be St. Patrick's Day when you watch this, but it's St. Patrick's Day when I'm filming it, and I have a corned beef going in the crock pot in the next room. So happy St. Patrick's Day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you later on. Bye.